Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to this seminar. And we're glad to welcome Gary Presland, who is going to speak to us about the history of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne. As we gather this afternoon, I'm just letting you know that those people who are joining us via YouTube, welcome, glad you can be with us. And just a reminder to those of you who are actually in the Zoom call to please keep yourselves on mute and to turn off your video if you do not wish to be recorded and broadcast. As we gather this afternoon, we acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and the stewardship that they've had of the land and the sea and the environment here in Melbourne for 60,000 or more years. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And here at St Margaret's, we've committed ourselves to working towards justice, the inclusion and a voice, and all that the Statement from the Heart has requested. To this end, I will hand over to Jenny Disney now, who is the chair of the Do Justice Committee here at St Margaret's, and she's going to introduce Gary.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary Presland. He's an archaeologist, historian and prize-winning author with particular interests in both pre-contact Aboriginal history and natural history in the Melbourne area. He's the author of 8 books and more than 25 articles of these subjects. We knew Gary was a local historian. What we've just learned is that Gary spent 3 years at Eltham High School in the 1960s. He's now a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society of Victoria, an Honorary Fellow in the School of Geography at the University of Melbourne, and an Honorary Associate of Museum Victoria. Over to you, Gary, and welcome.
She's turned his
Gary,
speaker.
you're still on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
She can't unmute himself. She has to do it. No, can't hear you, mate.
Done. How's that? Yep. Can people hear me now?
Yep.
I guess so. I guess if you're all muted, you can't tell me. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to speak about traditional Aboriginal culture in the Melbourne area, because as I was saying before the camera started rolling, as it were, there aren't a great deal of people who are doing this, and I think that it's a very important subject. I think it's something that we should be learning at the very earliest opportunity. Should be taught in schools, and increasingly it is. Unfortunately, I guess for a lot of schools, I'm not the person to go into a school room. The thought of being in a room with a lot of very young humans frightens me, and I would be completely tongue-tied. But I am happy to come out wherever and wherever possible and whenever I'm asked. So I'm glad to be able to have this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen, and this will be the last you see of me for a little while. I wasn't expecting that. Hold on a moment. What I need to do is minimize that. Can't. Bear with me. Now, I assume people can see that. I hope so.
No, we can't, Gary.
Ah, right, okay.
You might need to try sharing it again, making sure that it's the first in the sharing box.
Yes, the problem is that when I can't. I'll have to. I mean, selective window. Oh, there it is there. That's what I see. How's about that?
That's it. Thank you.
Okay, so,
Excellent.
okay. So I'll have to go back one. This isn't working. This is what I intended. Right. How about that? Is that working properly?
Yes, that's good.
Yep. So you can all see a slide that says pre-European Indigenous groups of the Port Phillip area. Okay, I've still got myself here. I'm going to. Okay. Now I will also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, and the wording I would use is, because I know about these things, I guess, is that we're meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri clan, members of the Woiwurrung language group, and a part of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And this, I find, is a very appropriate way to begin talking about this subject, because it introduces the terms that we are going to get used to hearing in the next 45 minutes or so. I'll begin with, and it's probably something I should say that most people don't know about, the relationships between things such as the Wurundjeri Willam, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, Kulin are terms which are bandied around, I think, but I rather doubt that many people understand what the Kulin is, let alone things like Woiwurrung and who were the Wurundjeri. So I'm here to explain all that to you. I'll start with the most complex thing I think I'll say today, and that is to talk about Aboriginal social organisation. The most important level of social organisation within traditional Aboriginal culture was a clan, and clans were named groups. They were named for usually in some sort of environmental feature of the area that they identified with, which we for practical purposes call an estate. Now, clans had names like Wurundjeri Willam or Wurundjeri Bullock. These are two separate bodies within the local clans of Melbourne. And Wurundjeri Willam literally means, Willam means people, and it means literally the people who lived in the area where white gums grew, and those white gums were home to the larval stage of a particular moth. I have entomological friends who regularly ask me, well, which species of moth was it? But unfortunately, that was never recorded. Wurundjeri is a joint word. Wurrun means the white gums, and Jerry is the term used to refer to the larval stage. So Wurundjeri Willam means literally people who lived in an area where there were white gums, and those white gums had larval grubs in them. Wurundjeri Bullock is something else which will become apparent in a few moments. So these were named groups where, and there were a number of them, well, all of Aboriginal Australia was peopled by clans. Where there were clans that shared, they had common boundaries and they spoke the same language, that formed what we refer to as a language group. And these language groups had names like this. Now you'll see straight away, of course, that these languages, the names of the languages have a certain commonality. They all end in arong, or they put the W in to make it pronounceable, I guess. And so there's Boonwurrung, Woiwurrung. I've highlighted the levels that are appropriate, that groups that are appropriate for the Melbourne area particularly. Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung were the two language groups that whose collective estates take in all of what Melbourne now. Wathaurong, Geelong area, Jaujarong in the Loddon Campaspe area, Toongarong north of the Dividing Range in the Goulburn River area, and Nagara Ilmarung, a small group, 3 clans only, I think, tucked up against the Murray River around about the Echuca area, and north of Toongarong. So all of the areas are between Bass Strait and the Murray River, in this case, north-south. Now, where all of these clans, these languages rather, were common, they had a common vocabulary, they were similar. Some linguists would say, well, it's really only one language with 6 different dialectical groups. But that I don't think makes any difference. We have 6 groups speaking 6 different languages or dialects. And where that is the case, where there is this commonality and the tribal areas, the areas of these language groups once again have common borders, then they form what is referred to as a nation. And in this case, the nation is called Kulin. Kulin is a word common to all of these languages that means human being. So if you don't speak one of these languages, then you are not a human being. So there's a very clear us and them distinction to be had. I should say, by the by, and by way of illustration of this, that everything I might say or have said about these groups, the Kulin groups, could be said equally about the groups in Gippsland, except that their name of their nation used to be Kurnai. It's now, then it became Gunai, and now it is Kurnai Gunai. So they have the same sort of structures in terms of social organisation values. So, but they do not speak Kulin any more than the Kulin people can speak Gunai. So these people are considered to be, they consider each other to be non-humans in one sense or another. Now you can do business with some of these groups. Some you're at enmity with. Some of them you can do business with, but you would not marry them. That's out of bounds. And then these groups, a clan might be anything between 100 and 150 people. So where you have, say, in the case of the Wurundjeri language group, there's depending on how you cut it, there's 5 clans. So that could be as much as 750 people. So clearly, all of those people do not go off hunting and gathering together every day. For practical purposes of this kind, the groups split up into small, unnamed foraging groups, which we tend to think of as bands. And they don't have names because the composition of them might change on a day-to-day basis almost. So these are the practical sort of as I say here, day-to-day economic functioning units based on families. Usually they're comprised of a couple of men, their wives and their children. And there will probably always be 1 or 2 single people who are there for reasons of relationship with somebody in that group. Now, on the ground, this is what the Kulin look like. The Woiwurrung language group is this group in here. Woiwurrung is the language, and the clans are named. They're named, and you can see the difference between the uppercase and lowercase. This signifies the moiety of the group. Moiety is it's an organising principle for the purposes of marriage groups, I think. And so in the case of the Woiwurrung language group, there are actually only 5, but one of the Wurundjeri Balak clan of Woiwurrung speakers was split in 2. There was a group called Wurundjeri Willem and another group called Balak Willem. Now, as I said, this means the people who lived in the area of White Gums. Balak Willem means people who lived in the area of wetlands. So there's a difference between. But collectively, these 2 groups made up one clan called Wurundjeri Balak. They spoke Woiwurrung, just as these 3 clans on the western side of the Woiwurrung territory, Kurrajong Balak, Murrin Balak, Gunnar Mullen Balak, also spoke Woiwurrung. Of all of these clans, 4 of the 5 were, that's counting these as 2, were Wa in moiety. And one of them, Gunnar Mullen Balak, was a Bunjil. Bunjil and Wa were the names of moiety. Literally means split in 2, and they named these moieties after the major creator spirits in the Kulin world, Bunjil and Wa. So that was the spread. Now, Woiwurrung here, Taungurung here, Ngara Ilmurrung, Boonwurrung, Wathaurong, Djadjurrung. There is a sort of a split, in fact, across the Kulin world, in that Boonwurrung, Woiwurrung, Taungurung, and Ngara Ilmurrung constitute the eastern Kulin. Wathaurong and Djadjurrung are what are referred to as the western. The distinction is drawn on the degree of separation in the languages. So there's a far greater difference between, say, Woiwurrung and Wathaurong than there is between Boonwurrung and Wathaurong and Woiwurrung. So these ones, the languages, these 4 languages, are a bit closer than they are to either of these, but they're still nonetheless part of one cultural block. Now, as I say, the Kulin is a cultural block. The word defines what a human being is. That is to say, people who believe certain things and speak certain languages, and they are marriageable. And within the cultural block, they are united in a number of ways. Firstly, they are united by kin. That is to say, they marry within their culture. As I said, you cannot marry outside of your national group. And they marry according to well-defined protocols and rules, which are things like this. Individuals married outside of their language group, but so they don't marry a person. When a person comes of marrying age, they don't marry somebody from the same clan. Clearly, they don't even marry for preference somebody from the same language group. They go outside of that. They go to a different language group, and there are preferences across the language group, which I'll speak about in a moment. So they marry somebody of the opposite moiety. And marriages are arranged. Women are given in marriage when they reach puberty, and when a girl reaches puberty, then their father, probably with the advice, well, I would assume their mother would tell them, tell the husband this, that she can get married now. The father, or if the father's deceased, then perhaps an older brother, will arrange a marriage for that girl. And that man will be, as I said, in a different language group. Whereas women married when they reached childbearing age, men did not marry until they completed a process of knowledge acquisition, if you want. They'd learned everything that was felt to be important. They still went on learning, of course, like everybody, but they could be said to be sufficiently knowledgeable about the way the world was working. which meant, of course, that there is a disparity in age. Women were married when they were girls, really, I suppose, 14, 15. Men could be probably close to 30, probably even more than 30. So there is a difference in age built into the system. The other rule was that within the Kulin world, women moved to live with the husband's group. Now, if I go back to the map, what this means is that if I live over here somewhere in Box Hill, I'm within Wurundjeri Willem territory. If I had a daughter and she becomes of marriageable age, I will contract, if that's the word, with somebody from the Taungurung area. That's our preference. Woiwurrung people tend to marry into Taungurung and vice versa, of course. Boonwurrung, on the other hand, tended to marry Wathaurong. And that's why there is a little strip around the top of the bay there, which is Boonwurrung territory. That is the estate of a group called Yalakat Willem, of whom Derrimut, who you may have heard of, was the clan head, the Arwit in Boonwurrung. That allowed Boonwurrung people and Wathaurong people to have ready access to each other, because if logically the Woiwurrung's collective territory went right down to the edge of the bay, then these two groups would have to constantly be coming to the Woiwurrung owners of the land and saying, can we travel through your country? So to get around that, at some time in the past, there was an arrangement made whereby there's a strip of indeterminate width went around the top of the bay as far as the Werribee River, which was the eastern boundary of Wathaurong territory. So to get back to the marriage, the young girl from Wurundjeri country, state, moved over to live with her husband in one of these clans. And you'll note that many of those clans, whereas Wurundjeri Willem is people who are born into the Wurundjeri Willem clan, their moiety is Wa. But look at all the clans in the Taungurung area that are lowercase, which means they are all Wa. They are, Bunjil. And so there's no end of marriage partners. Unlike the situation, say, in Central Australia, where they don't have just two moieties, they have 16 different groups, because they've split the moieties and then split that again. So you end up with 16 different groups, and finding a marriage partner can be a difficult exercise. You have to find one in the appropriate category. To do other would be it'd be worse than marrying out. It would be against the rules and be censured very severely. But there's here it's a bit easier. There's only two groups. So my daughter goes and lives over there. Now that might seem a bit harsh, but you might think, well, how's she going to speak the language? But you have to remember, of course, that the generation before, her mother came in the opposite direction. So her mother came to live with a Wurundjeri man. She didn't stop being a Taungurung woman, or whichever clan she came from, and she continued to speak Taungurung. So that girl, like all other children in Aboriginal society, grew up being at least bilingual. She spoke the language of the clan that she was born into, but she could also speak the language of her mother's clan, because connections endured. And so when she moves over to Taungurung territory, she can converse very easily with the locals over here. And there are economic reasons, which, if I have time later, I can explain, of why this is a preferred model, that your connections extend across considerable distances. Okay, so as we've seen, the Kulin people were connected by kin but they're also connected by thought. That is to say, they all believe in the same creator stories. They have the same creator beings, Bunjil and Wa, who are beings who can shapeshift, I guess is the term. Sometimes they're in the wood-style eagle in the case of Bunjil, sometimes they're a human, and vice versa. And the same with Wa, who is the little raven. So eagle, hawk and crow, you might say, which is the name of an 1880s anthropological study of Aboriginal culture. They're connected also across the Kulin world by their commonality of languages, as I've already spoken about. And as I said, Kulin was one term that was common to all of the languages and meant human beings. And that was a defining feature of the Kulin world. I thought I'd say something very briefly about how these groups are governed. They don't, unlike us, we elect people and we send them off to somewhere else, and they presumably, hopefully, represent all our interests, diverse as they are. And we're happy to have that happen. But in Aboriginal society, they're wonderfully democratic because everybody gets to express their opinion about the major things that are happening in the world. And they have a person, a man, in each of the clans who is referred to in the Woiwurrung language, the word is Nurungata. In the Boonwurrung language, the word is Awit. And these men are clan heads, but they're not chiefs as sometimes referred to. They can't tell members of their clan what to do. Moreover, they still have to get their own food every day. What they are really are spokespersons for spokesmen. They're all men, unfortunately. For their group, and at the major meetings of Kulin clan heads, they represent the interests of their clan, and those interests have been decided on the basis of long discussion, wherein everybody gets to express their opinion if they want to, and a collective decision is reached, which is conveyed to a larger meeting or meeting of clan heads by these people. Now, in the Wurundjeri Willem, there were in fact three separate mobs, if you like, and so they had three different clan heads, and these were men who, all of whom were signatories of the Batman Treaty. They were Bebijan, whose territory is on the north side of the Yarra from Darabin Creek to the source of the Yarra. On Wurundjeri on the south side of the river from Gardiner's Creek to the Yarra Flats, and Wurundjeri was the father of William Barrack. And Billibelleri, who was on the north side of the Yarra from the Maribyrnong River to Darabin Creek. Billibelleri was probably the preeminent, the paramount Nurungata, the paramount clan head in the Kulin world at the time that Europeans invaded the country. There's a picture of him, a drawing of him by William Thomas, and of his wife and child. And this is a representation of the spatial spread of the three mobs, as I put it. There's the Yarra running between them. And here, this is Billibelleri's group. They are literally patrilineals in that they all descended from brothers at some time in the past. So here's Billibelleri's mob, Bebijan and Wurundjeri. That's how they spread across the landscape. That was literally their estates. And to the south of them, it was the Balakwillam. They had a difference. There was only one sort of half a clan, if you like. Okay, let's talk about practical day-to-day things. People lived in relatively small groups, and this is a typical picture of a camp. There's always a bit of artistic license involved in these things, but you can see the sort of habitations that were put up. And this would be in a late spring or summer. It would not be in winter. There was a great deal of movement built into Aboriginal life, and one of the causes of movement was, I guess, essentially seasonal, in that people tended to, in the colder months, colder and particularly colder and windier months, they sought shelter in the upper country of their estates. And all of the estates had an up country and a down country and a flat country, and they would not be down on the river flats in the depths of winter. By and large, they would be up in the at least in the foothills and maybe more of the Dandenongs, or if you were the Kurrajong Balak or Gunung Balak, then it's the Dividing Range. But so this sort of scenes clearly is based on summer, a native encampment on the banks of the Yarra. And by and large, people made their living. They moved around a bit. As I said, seasonally they did. The seasonal aspect of it takes in, of course, the availability of foods. So people could only subsist if they could get food within a day's walk from their camp. If they couldn't do that, then they would move the camp. And they trended across the year up along the river valleys to the higher country, so that they would be in the higher country before, as winter was beginning, and they come spring, they would move back out again, come back down the rivers. So, and all the time they would be making their living through gathering and hunting. Usually, traditionally, we've always referred to this as hunting and gathering, but really, if we wanted to be fair about this, we would have to say gathering, hunting, for reasons which will become apparent in a moment. This is a way of life. It's very old. It started with the first humans 3 million years ago, and it continued up until about 10,000 years ago when people began farming. So it's a very old and well practiced way of making a living. But it does bespeak a certain sexual division of labour, i.e. men hunt, women gather. But there has always been, I suspect, since Whitey's took an interest in it and devised a thing called anthropology, there have been some myths up until very recently. The first one is that it was the men who provided the bulk of the food. And I think this has probably come about because in the early days of anthropological fieldwork, all of the field workers were men. And they went out with the men when they were living with the subject group. So they only saw what men were doing. And they didn't appreciate it. They probably didn't think that women were doing anything important, but they only observed the men, and the men did interesting things like hunting and fishing. So they came to this conclusion that men it was who provided the bulk of the food. Well, that's a myth, in fact, because it's actually women who provide the bulk of the food. More recent studies within the last, say, 50 years or more, have shown that when you get back to camp, it's the women who come back to camp, and the groups separate at the beginning of the day. Women and children go one way, and men and the older boys go to a different area. And the men go hunting, and the women go gathering. So back at the camp, it's always the women who come back with food. They never come back empty-handed, whereas men did come back empty-handed sometimes because they simply didn't catch anything, or the game wasn't there, or maybe they just sat under a tree talked all day and then went home and said, sorry, dear, we couldn't find anything. So that's a myth that men provided the bulk of food. In studies everywhere across the world where hunting and gathering groups existed, it was seen that women always provided more food, more regularly. Second myth is that these people lived, hunter-gatherers lived hand-to-mouth existences, chasing food all the time. In fact, once again, studies have shown that you could get everything you want in 4 to 5 hours. So they were working on average probably about a 30, 35 hour week, which is certainly better than we've managed to do. And sure, they had to go out every day, but they did it very easily. And they went out early in the day. By the early afternoon, they'd be back in camp, and they spent more time from then on. They'd spend more time probably thinking about and doing the things that were more important to traditional Aboriginal people. The Indigenous people of this country had a very well developed spiritual base, and they used their time in hand to develop that spiritual base rather than accumulating more and more materials. So a few pictures here of how the people made a living is John held a wedge on the Bellarine Peninsula, 1835. There are a group of women wading around in a wetland, digging up the roots of various plants there, and you can see they have slung over their back a bag, and they've got the ubiquitous digging stick. This was the universal tool for women. Every woman had a digging stick they could use to lever things out of the ground, dig burrows of little smaller animals anything that crossed their path. And at times they could use them for, if there was a fight going on, they could wade in and swirl around with a 6-foot digging stick, which would be a reasonably dangerous thing to do. Men, of course, went out hunting, and hunting primarily was based on camouflage. And you can see in this SD Gill watercolour that a couple of men sneaking up on emu, holding up bushes in front of them. And they used fire, of course. And the use of fire in Aboriginal society is a whole study and area of contention on its own. It used to be thought that fire was just used for clearing animals from the undergrowth and out of the forest and that sort of thing. But in fact, there's much more to it than that. And fire was used, yes, and every European account of travelling through Aboriginal country notes the fact that there was fire. There were always fires being lit. In some part, it might have been to deter the Europeans, but people were going about their business in the time-honoured way by using fire to clean up their country. And this they saw as being what they were intended to do. Every animal has a purpose within the creation, including humans. And the role of humans was to keep the world going the way it is, just to maintain it by looking after their country and doing what they were told to do, maintain the status quo, I guess. And fire was used thus as a management tool in any given area where fire was applied. It was done so in a frequency of about 3 to 5 years. And this had impacts in terms of the natural environments that they were living in. They in fact maintained many areas at a particular level of vegetation cover. If you regularly fire things every 3 to 5 years, you don't get many trees growing. And so, for example, the grassy plains on the western side of the Maribyrnong, stretching out into Western Victoria, which were the main attraction for the European population streaming in from 1835, because those people were mainly sheep farmers. Those were not naturally natural areas. They had been created, in fact, by the Aboriginal burning that had been going on for untold hundreds, thousands of years probably. So it maintains particular regimes which the traditional owners found much more useful. And what was happening was that it maximised the growth of certain species, those that had tubers. These were ground-dwelling plants, herbaceous species that had little bulbs and sometimes not so little, tubers such as lilies, orchids, and one called murnog. And it promoted diversity in the tussock grasslands by burning off everything else. And so they promoted the growth of these things by burning off anything that would shade the surface of the ground where these things were growing. And what happened was, when people came to that part of their country, and they went about their strategies for collecting the tubers from these things, if they just somebody whose job it was to judge these things would say, well, they're a bit small, we'll have to fire the country now, and then keep it going the way it was. And the next year they came back, they would find was that the tubers were bigger, because they had previous year the crop of tubers, if you want, had been reduced in size because the plants had been shaded by other species, bushes and plants that didn't allow as much sunlight falling on the ground. So this was a way of maintaining a food source over a period of time. And of course, that also had impacts on local animal species, because if you change the vegetation anywhere, then you change the suite of animals that are going to use these things. So over a period of time, people were managing their landscape. And many of you may have read or heard of a book called The Biggest Estate on Earth, which is, it's by, somebody's name now eludes me, but it's become a very popular book, and it looks at the whole of Australian vegetation zones, and comes up with, I think, a rather hard to substantiate, but probably at one end of the spectrum, if you like, made the claim that there is no environment in Australia that has not been created by pre-European Aboriginal burning and management. I think that's probably overstating the case, but it does. There is something in that. Women had a particular role in this whole process, because they were the ones who dug up the tubers in the ordinary course of events. So after the firing, the women would come in and dig up the tubers that were there, and this served to promote the growth of the species in the forthcoming season by combining the nutrients in the soil. And it aerated the soil, and it thinned out the plants. All of these things helped to promote better growth. So the next year they came round, as I say, they got a bigger crop of tubers. And the sorts of plants that were being used in these ways were things you see here, like I don't know what these things are. These are orchids, and I thought they had names on them, but they haven't come out. And this one here is the yam daisy. It was prolific. It grew right across the countryside, wherever there was a bit of water and there was open vegetation. It was a major source of food for Indigenous people. And the roots of these things look like this. These are vanilla lily tubers. So you can see they're quite substantial in size is the poor picture of Murnong roots. All of these things go cooked in earth ovens. So this was a strategy that people had in the Kulin world. In Victoria, they did this in many places. It was a practice that was widespread in Western New South Wales, not Kulin country, of course, but Western New South Wales. They focused more on grasses, so that what their intent was to grow more of the native grasses that had seeds, and they would gather those seeds, which were more numerous, of course, because of the practices of the firing that had taken place, and they would grind these grasses up into a flour sort of thing. And what's his name, Bruce Pascoe, would suggest that they thus invented bread by baking these things. So they didn't go for their tubers in the way that they did in, say, Western Victoria and across on the western side of the Kulin country and across the north of what is now Melbourne as well, where the Cranbourne grasslands, for example, are exactly grasslands because of these sorts of practices on the part of Aboriginal people. Now, I'll just finish up with a quick image of the book that they first wrote about these things in 1985. And this is the third edition of the book that I wrote then, which was called The Land of the Kulin. And then it became Aboriginal Melbourne in the second edition. This is the third edition and it's still in print. It's in libraries. I know we can't get to either bookshops or libraries at the moment, but if you're interested in finding out more detail, and I have to say that in the course of the talk, I could go on for another few hours and probably still not give you everything that's in this book. So if you are interested, this is my latest word on the subject. And I note just in passing that there was a mistake in the advertising for this talk. The title of the book was given as First People, the Eastern Kulin of Melbourne, Port Melbourne and Central Victoria. That's really Port Phillip and Central Victoria. Thank you very much, and questions are by all means welcome.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for a wonderful introduction and summary of life for the Wurundjeri people. I think I'm going to hand over to Helen now. So Helen, let me find you so I can unmute you. Helen Robertson, ask to unmute. There we are. So Helen's going to manage the questions which have been coming in, and she's got a few questions for you, Gary.
Okay, fire away.
Oh, thank you, Gary. There's quite a few, and there's some around similar topics, so I'm sort of grouping those together.
Right.
But one of the ones that's just popped up was key features of spiritual base of the Wurundjeri Council. What might they have been?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of the question, Helen.
What might the key features of a spiritual base be for the Wurundjeri culture?
Oh, now that is a very interesting question. The forms of spirituality that were part of the life of the Kulin were that there were particular places around their estates that were, which we'll say, just they're special places because they each one relates to a particular animal, and these are sort of totemic creatures. And part of what Aboriginal people had to do, part of what all Indigenous people were doing around Australia was, if you like, completing a series of ceremonies or rituals around their country, in addition to the practical things such as the firing and making sure that their country was being looked after. They also had to perform certain rituals and take part in ceremonies at these particular places. Now, these are essentially, as I say, totemic activities, which means that they only had meaning to the people for whom the particular creature was a totem. And what I'm saying is that all the people in any given clan were not part of the same totem. So if your totem was, say, the bandicoot, then at a particular time of year you had to be at a particular place to enact the ceremony that would ensure that that creature continued to be. In anthropological terminology, it's called an increase ceremony, but the intent was not to increase the number of bandicoots, for example, but rather to increase the time that these things would exist. And so it was believed that in order to keep the world going as it was, people had to engage in these things each year. Now, what constituted a sacred place or a spiritual place, these things, all of this activity is spiritual. Indeed, such was the life of Indigenous people that nothing they did was not spiritual. Nothing. Everything was dictated by this desire, this to follow orders, to do what they had been created to do, and that is to, by dint of following the practice, marrying the right ways, enacting the ceremonies, following the guidelines, if you like, that have been laid down by the creator spirits, the world would keep on going the way it is. But these places that they did these things in need not have anything particularly significant about them that is visual. You would not know. Only the people for whom those places were sacred, and that was a secret. Only those people for whom it was sacred would know that it was a sacred place. Except that if there was somebody else was wandering around, then they would be warned off. They would just be told, look, don't go there. This whole society is, as I say, spiritually based. But it's also extremely conservative in that people, by and large, don't go out of their way to invent something new. That new things were invented, but I think it was more by accident than intent, because to do that would be to go against the rule. Just keep it going the way it is. I don't know whether that answers your question or not.
I think it does very well. So then, could we say spiritually, are they more likely to return to their spiritual bases, or are they, for instance, when they set up camps and were moving across the seasons, would the seasons determine it more than the spiritual base?
I don't know that you can quantify it in that way, Helen. I mean, they had to move for practical purposes. The seasonal thing determined that people at a particular time of year would be up in a particular area. Now, it's probable, it seems to me, that for those people for whom, say, wombat was a totem, that they would engineer it, or the system would be engineered in such a way that they would be where the wombats were. There'd be no point in, if there was a creature that only came out at a particular time of year, there'd be no point in having it as a totem that you had to maintain to have it at the other end of your estate. When you were up in the high country, it was down in the low. That would be a little, make it really difficult. Yeah.
The other thing with moving camps, someone has asked about the seasons, because it's very European to have, well, for here in Victoria to have 4 seasons.
Oh, yes.
And
Yep.
someone was asking about they had different seasons. So what were their seasons?
Okay, there were 7 in the Coolum world. Well, I shouldn't say the Coolum world because things might have been, certainly were different environmentally or ecologically, say, in the Taungurung part of the Coolum world. And we all know that the climate or weather on the northern side of the range is different to that on the south. So, and that's one of the reasons why people contract marriages across the divide, the dividing range, because if things are a bit grim in the south and you're living down here as a Wurundjeri person, but you have marital connections with a group in the north, that gives you a link. And that means you can, because it's like this, if I give my daughter to a man who lives up near Seymour and things get a bit grim down here on the bay or near the bay, I can go to him and say, look, I've given you my daughter in marriage, so you owe me, because that girl, because she's a gatherer, like all the women, she will provide him with food for the rest of her life. And so he owes me a favour. And one way of redeeming that is for me to say, okay, well, look, things are a bit grim down in my part of the world. I'm coming up here to hunt and gather and forage with your group. And so that, and this is happening in both directions, of course. So I only say that in the sense that things will be different in a different part of the Kulin world. But in the Wairarung area, which incidentally is really the the catchment area of the Yarra River, is Wairarung territory. Where water drains into the Yarra, it's Wairarung. Now, in that area, the people defined 7 seasons. And so I can't tell you the names of them, but they're named after beings that come out of that time. And so when a particular plant blossoms, then then that's a sign, if you like, that the next season has arrived. And so if they couldn't tell because of the weather, the ambient temperature or something of that kind, then they would know that, this is the season. And that would give them a sign to say, okay, well, certain resources will become available as we move towards them. And another link between the movement of seasons and resources is the fact that people, as I said earlier, people moved upstream toward, like in autumn. So in the March, April, when things are beginning to cool down a bit, people are moving up the rivers. And that is when, coincidentally, you might say, that is when mature eels are moving down the river. And so you get these eeling sites, and the two, like people moving up the river, meet the eels coming down at Boland Swamp. And it's a win for, well, it's not a win for the eels, but they at least, the people knew that was going to happen. And so they go there by way of moving up there anyway, but they go there and find that the eels are there, and that gives them a means to gather. Boland Swamp was, which is in Baleen, that's why we call it Baleen, was a major meeting place for the Kulin, because it's a place where there was a ready supply of food for in larger quantity than usual. But yes, to get back to the question, 7 seasons.
Right, thank you. Now another question was regarding, were male or female children preferred in any way? Because somebody asked, if you had a lovely daughter, would you be wanting to give them up quite so young? And so were girls or boys favoured more?
I doubt very much whether the preferences worked in that way, because, not to be too hard about it, if I had a daughter and I knew that I could give her away, I wouldn't be just getting rid of her a pesky teenager, I'd be actually. I have to say that the children probably weren't all that pesky because they didn't have the problem that we have in our society of that in between sort of juvenile delinquency is born of an in between state between infancy and adulthood, whereas in the case of boys, when the girls were getting married, being married off, the boys were being subjected to some rather questionable activities by way of initiation, and so you can decide who were getting the worst deal. The major determining factor in terms of children was how many children a woman could support, because this was a generally mobile society, and everybody once you could walk. In terms of children were taught to gather food while they're out with their mothers. And so as soon as they could be trusted to be able to stand up and walk around on their own, they were gathering their own food as they went. But until then, somebody, and certainly at the beginning of their lives, children had to carry, the mothers had to carry the children. Now, a woman can carry one child and still pay her way, as it were, still gather food, but she can't carry two and gather food as well. So there were at least a whole range of measures which tended to inhibit births sooner than about 3 or 4 years apart, to give the woman time to get rid of one before she had another.
Right.
So that was the preference, not the gender of the child.
Fine, thank you. Now, someone else has asked about John Batman.
Yes.
And the question says, do you know anything about the marks of 8 heads of groups
Yes.
on the deeds
Yep.
with John Batman about marking the territory? And where there was and some sticks, some messaging sticks that had their marks on as well.
Yeah. Okay, the deed was supposedly signed might be read in inverted commas perhaps. Certainly there were marks made, and it's thought that each of these marks signified a different clan head. And the 8 people, I think it was 8, who signed that have been identified. They are all clan heads. So there were people like the 3 that I mentioned, for example. And these were the relevant clan heads for the area that they thought that was being dealt with. Now, whether it's not clear by any means exactly how those marks came to be put on the deed, except, clearly they couldn't be signed because obviously Aboriginal people weren't literate in that sense. They could certainly make some sort of mark, and whether that was then replicated on the deed, I'm not sure. It's a bit uncertain about that because Batman, which is Batman's reminiscence of it, is really the only source in terms of an eyewitness account of what transpired. I find it hard to get my head around exactly what anybody on either side of the negotiation thought that they were doing. It's commonly thought that Batman had brought these a small group of Indigenous people from the Sydney area, but those Sydney area fellows would have been as much in the dark as Batman was, because they couldn't have spoken any of the languages that were understandable by Aboriginal people. They would. It was lucky they didn't get away with a few spear marks in them. But the whole thing is it's a complex sort of situation, which is very hard to explain in details that we could make any sense of now.
Thank
And
you.
certainly, Batman might have thought that he was buying or renting the area. That wouldn't be what Aboriginal people would be thinking, certainly, because they had no notion of ownership in that sense. To talk about them being the original owners would be, anathema to Indigenous people. This is part of how spiritual they were, is that they drew absolutely no distinction at all between themselves and their country. We often think about the way in which people want to be in their country, and that's because that is them. They can't draw any distinction between them, let alone sell it, give it away. So presumably they were enacting some ceremony that would allow people to come and stay for a brief time with their blessing, and on the expectation that those people would then subsequently go away. In that, unfortunately, they were greatly in error.
Yes, thank you. Now, there's another question here regarding many Indigenous peoples use the stars to navigate for long distances. Is there evidence to suggest the Wurundjeri use the stars to travel long distances?
I could go on about this. It's undoubtedly the case that they had a very detailed understanding of the placement of the stars, but to what extent they were using them as sort of astral signposts is, I think, questionable, because they didn't travel at night to begin with.
Yes.
And they knew their country intimately. They didn't need to look up to see where they were or where they were heading, because they had things like song lines that they could follow, and they would go through the country. But they did all their travelling. They did it during the day. At night they camped. They stayed. They set up camp, and they turned in at dark. Well, they might have sat around the fire for a little while, maybe, but they turned in relatively early, and they got up very early. There are suggestions that have been made regarding a couple of 3 or 4 places around Victoria. None within. There is actually one within. There's one within the Kulin World, a stone arrangement at Carisbrook.
Oh, yes.
And there's a stone arrangement down towards Geelong called Wurundjeri. Now, nobody knows with any certainty what these things were for, because nobody ever saw Aboriginal people there doing whatever it is they put the stones together for. And that's not surprising, because what they were doing was something that would have been secret sacred. And so they're not going to be inviting all and sundry to come and watch. But for some reason or other, some people have taken it into their minds to suggest that these things are astral calculators. Places like Stonehenge, these are, if you look at if you line up 2 of the stones in any given, the word Yuang one, which is in the shape of a large sort of egg shape on the ground, very large. And if you line up 2 of the stones at the right time of year, it shows you where the sun is going to come up at the equinox. Now, I think to myself, that sort of thing is very European, or it shows them where true north is. Well, that's European as well. People who did not plant crops had no need to know these things. Last time I said this at a presentation, somebody took me to task for diminishing the curiosity of Indigenous people. Well, they were as curious as anybody, but they didn't have any real need to know, or indeed, they probably didn't realise that there were people somewhere else in the world that called a particular direction north. So it is a bit, I find it a bit sort of taxing to think that we have to explain these things in some sort of European framework before they make sense. Why can't we just accept the fact that there are things that we don't know, and Indigenous people today, you know, people, members of the Wathaurong Corporation may posit solutions. Nobody's in a position to say no, that's nonsense. But somehow or other, we want to. Some people just want to explain it all in terms that Europeans can understand.
Thank you.
I'm not going to say anything more. I'll get boring and annoyed. Not in that order.
I'm getting a lot of messages here saying that must be teachers. They've said that they've used your books in class,
Yes.
especially in year 9.
Oh, yes.
And that it was very good for, in fact, the book was The Invasion that they used with the year 9s, and good for explaining the culture, if others perhaps are interested. But also,
thank you.
Eltham, there's one message here that says they learned a lot of things from the Aboriginal friends. I'm sorry. At Eltham High School, it was acknowledged in the late 1970s, and there was a lot learnt from that time. So
Right, okay.
a lot of people around, and there's lots of compliments for you and your presentation today. One last question is, someone did ask about, did finding gold around Ballarat have an impact on that area at the time and the people?
Absolutely. In a number of ways, there have been major studies done. There's a fellow called Fred Carr, Cahir, who's written, I think it was probably even his PhD. He teaches at Federation University in Ballarat, and he has written about the impact on Indigenous people in that area. These people in language group terms would be Djadjurrung. And they were impacted on in a number of different ways. Firstly, it was local Indigenous people who showed Europeans where the resources were to be had, such as where there was fresh water, you know, where certain sorts of vegetation was growing, that sort of thing, in order to, in the practical terms of maintaining themselves in that area. The huge number of people who were flooded into the area, of course, had a greatly detrimental impact on local people. Of course, by then, most of the Indigenous people in the area had been gathered together in places like the Aboriginal Protectorate stations. There was one at Franklin Ford near Dalesford, just to the west of Dalesford. And there was another one up towards Murchison. So people had been, the major intent of the Protectorate was to gather Indigenous groups from right across Victoria into specific locations, so that they wouldn't be a nuisance for the invading pastoralists. But even so, there were still people, Indigenous people, who had not been party to that, and they were massively impacted on by the huge numbers of Europeans. But also, of course, the impact that had, there was a diminishment of the spiritual being of the country, in a sense, because, of course, huge amounts of vegetation were cleared from the country. A lot of dirt was dug. Holes were, shafts were put down. Rivers were changed. Streams were changed in their course. So all of these things had an impact on Indigenous life, because all of those things were part of their world, and thus, in some fundamental sense, part of their very being. So their whole way of life was was at threat because of the presence of these people who worked to a different agenda altogether.
Yes. Good, thank you. Now, one last one. There's quite a number of questions about, can you speak about eel traps in the Yarra catchment area?
Oh yes, eel traps. Yes, there's more than one way to catch an eel. But, and eels are interesting things because they, if for no other reason, that they live in fresh water and they breed in salt. So they're around in the freshwater lagoons. They come up the rivers as mere striplings, and or there is a word for it, but a young eel, an eellet or something, and they mature in freshwater, in lagoons and up in the higher reaches of rivers, and then come March, April, they migrate down to breed, the females at least, migrate down and go around and reproduce in the Coral Sea. They all come, they swim all the way up to the Coral Sea, and then the younger ones swim back down again and find their way back up the rivers. I can't imagine how exactly they do that, but they're there in great numbers. Now, there is an account of a couple of young men wading around in one of the lagoons on the south side of the river, just near where the Botanic Gardens are now, catching eels by holding two spears, and they waded around until they felt an eel on the bottom of the lagoon. They'd hold the eel down with the 1 foot, and they would spear it. They'd spear it with one of the spears. So to me, it's very dangerous, but and then they'd pull it out, lift it up out of the water, and if it wasn't dead, they'd kill it with the other spear, and then they'd throw the eel up onto the bank. That's one way of doing it. There's also a record from the first European settlement, first European exploration of the Port Phillip area, the Grimes expedition in 1803. They noticed that there was a weir on the Maribyrnong River, probably up around Avondale Heights, somewhere there, where they came to a place where, in the words of the diarist, they put the Aborigines had built a weir across the river, and this is a constriction of the flow of the river, and they would build these things and the water, and leave a couple of holes in them, so the water had to flow through those holes, and so the eels, in order to move to whichever direction downstream they'd be going, they would come through the hole and they would be easily caught. Usually they also had an eel pot that they would put on the downstream side, and the eels would simply go straight into the net, and they would be taken out and flung onto the bank of the river.
Good.
That's the two principal ways of how they took the eels.
Thank you. Now, just one other little thing that's popped up is, are your slides available at all? Or are they your own property?
I can make them available if people want.
Well, perhaps I might allow others to contact you through the office at St Margaret's.
Yep.
So I'll just
Helen,
hand back to Karen now, and thank you for answering your question.
I think Karen wants to say something.
yeah, that's okay. Thank you, Helen, for curating the question time for us, and thank you, Gary, for your erudite answers. And I can tell you that we have been recording this, and because there have been a few issues with the live stream today, and my apologies for that, some technological problems, I will actually be posting a recording of this to our YouTube channel. And we can, if you email me the slides, we can make them available on our website for people to access.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Now I hand over to David.
You'll have to, oh, there we go. So Gary, thank you very, very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for your presentation this afternoon. We here in Eltham, very specifically, right here in Eltham, are very familiar with the eel traps at Laughing Waters, which are actually known to be and are in fact constructed to be eel traps. And it happens that the eels come up the river still every year. So Laughing Waters thusly named. But we also thank you, Gary, for giving us a very human picture of the people who are here, because it's often lost in the all the tumult of daily news and so forth. But they had a very human and a very spiritually rich lifestyle. And we, of course, at St. Margaret's are very interested in the spirituality, the spiritual dimension, because that's why we're here. And that's what we want to discover and reconcile and discover how we can reconcile, boost and continue to work for reconciliation in particular, perhaps through that channel, because that's something that we immediately link with, in addition to the anthropology and the, but Aboriginal theology, yes, that's where we're interested. That's right there. So, you know, it's all one thing in the Aboriginal case. So thank you very much, Gary. And I think Christopher is going to finish with some thoughts.
And just before Christopher does that, I will let you know that we will be forwarding a thank you to you, Gary. So look out for that in your email.
Thank you.
Let me find Christopher
Gary.
so I can ask him to unmute. There we go.
Thank you, Gary. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Wonderful. I have been asked to share a prayer, so I'd just like to do that. Creative Spirit, we thank you for Gary Presland. Thank you for his life, his experience, his knowledge, and his willing heart for sharing today about the Wurundjeri peoples and the Kulin Nation. Bless and empower him and his family as he shares this message. May we all have open hearts and minds to work for righting the wrongs of the past. Help us to listen and respect each other's story, each other's journey, and each other's spirituality. Enable us to show esteem, forgiveness, and love in all we do and say. May the Creative Spirit bless you with the discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you will live deep within your heart. May the Creative Spirit bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you will work for justice, equity, and peace. May the Creative Spirit bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, and indifference, so that you'll reach out your hand to comfort them and change their pain to joy. And may the Creative Spirit bless you with the foolishness to think that you can make a difference in the world, so that you will do the things which others tell you cannot be done. And we ask all of this in the name of the great Creative Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you again, Gary, for your wisdom. And look out for this video on our YouTube channel and the slides on the St. Margaret's website. And I wish you all a pleasant afternoon.